Welcome into Rounding the Bases Live, presented by Enterprise Bank and Trust. This is a milestone day. We like round numbers, and this is episode number 50. Started this back in March, the latter part of March, as this pandemic was taking over our lives and the way we went about things. It was an opportunity to share stories about leadership and how companies and individuals are helping out within the community. And it's really, to me, been a phenomenal opportunity to stay connected at a time where so many of us are home. And this will continue once we are back in the offices. Many of you already are. I think that there, in my opinion, and from the responses I've heard, has been a real strong interest in this. As long as there's an interest, I'll keep doing it. As long as there are stories, I'll keep telling them. I don't think the stories ever go away. They might change. So I feel real privileged to be able to do that. Couldn't do it without the help of Enterprise Bank and Trust. Hashtag no stopping you. I really have enjoyed the partnership with Jeff Carson, Enterprise Bank, and his people. And then I love talking every day about Casey Cattle Company. Have done so the last couple of months. Patrick Montgomery, former U.S. Army Ranger, and his staff, veteran-owned and operated Wagyu beef up in Weston, Missouri. Check out the website. They fly through their supply quickly. So you got to hit it right. Just check back on a regular basis. I like to hit it late at night, or if you're up, like after midnight or so, check on that as they reload burgers, brats, hot dogs, award-winning hot dogs, steaks, you name it. It's unbelievable. You could also take a look at their social media at Casey Cattle Company, and then really excited this week to bring on JJ's Wine and Spirits. So if you're down in Johnson County and you're looking to pick up beer, wine, liquor, cocktails, all that good stuff, you could do so at JJ's Wine and Spirits. Tomorrow, if you love wine, is the day. We got to have that alliteration. Wine Wednesday, 15% off of all bottles. Mason, Jake, and their staff will take care of you. They are on the southwest corner of Antioch and College in Overland Park. So really appreciate their support. I was in over the weekend, and they'll probably be back at some point soon too. Now, as for my guest, I want to set this up by saying this, that yesterday was to me one of the more important discussions I've had on this show. My guest was Angel Magee. She's with the Kansas City Urban Youth Academy, the Kansas City Royals, the Kansas City Chiefs. And the purpose of that episode originally was to talk about the Urban Youth Academy. We did that, but it really went into a much deeper discussion about racial injustice, what's going on in our country right now. It's certainly something that's on everyone's mind, and that was a really important discussion to have. I mention that right now because as all of the protests have gone on, personally, I feel like the pandemic has been pushed aside. And I am not and will not be the guy that comes on this podcast and tells you what you should or shouldn't do. It's not my style. It's just not. Some people want to wear masks. Some people don't. By the way, it's not that I want to wear a mask. I feel like it's important to wear a mask. But that's the decision I'm making. I'm going to do the best that I can to keep my family safe, to stay healthy, to protect those around me. I'm not here to have the debates over what the right thing or the wrong thing is. I wish we could all unite together on that. But what I do feel like, and my guest today has been scheduled for a few weeks, so the timing just works out, that maybe as we're all starting to reemerge a little bit, get back into the offices, we're letting our guard down some. Again, everybody's different. But can we walk and chew gum at the same time? Because I feel like as our focus has shifted to these protests, and deservedly so, are we then forgetting about, have we pushed this whole pandemic aside? So that's a very long way for me to introduce the regional administrator for FEMA's Region 7, which is, by the way, right here in Kansas City. And so I'm happy to be joined right now by Paul Taylor of FEMA, who I think we connected on LinkedIn way back when I was starting this podcast, maybe 47 or so episodes again. So Paul ends up being the lucky winner of episode number 50, but the timing couldn't be better. First and foremost, we've got a lot to talk about. How are you doing?
I'm great, Joe. I appreciate you asking, and I'm glad that we finally linked up. And I didn't know until a few minutes ago that this was the 50th episode, so little more weight on my shoulders today, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a parting gift, or I could try to come up with something. The Royals had their 50th anniversary season a couple of years ago, but there's a lot. And by the way, you'll find this interesting too. Uh, I will, and I'm not a veteran of the military, but I find that anything I do with the military or veterans is always worth my while and hopefully worth everyone else's. Not just in a way of saying, hey, thank you for your service. I think that's important. I think we can dig deeper than that. But I just personally find that whenever I have some type of connection to the military, I learn something. Because leadership at the military level has to be better than anyone else's because their lives on the line. It's the country, everything. And so I just wanted to say, because Paul's a veteran of the Army, tomorrow, episode 51 will be a discussion about leadership during challenging times with a retired brigadier general and a retired rear admiral from the Navy. And I'm going to try to encourage them to fight a little bit too, because I know how that Army-Navy thing goes. But you do have that military experience, right?
Sure. Well, can I just say beat Navy first off, right off the bat? But no, that's true. My background, I spent more than 20 years in the Army. And my first assignment being at Fort Riley, Kansas, which is sort of where I got my roots. I met a gal, and we've been married since then. Met a girl from Kansas, and so after I retired, we ended up back in Kansas City. Her family grew up just about an hour south of Kansas City, out in very much rural America, and we knew that this was the place where we wanted to continue to raise our kids. And it's been a great path ever since. I worked briefly in the private sector with a tech startup doing cybersecurity work, and that was I think good for me. But I had an amazing opportunity presented to me to go back into public service to work with FEMA. And I'll tell you what, being in the military was one of the greatest privileges of my life. My family and I, it was great for us. So everybody spends a lot of time saying thank you for your service, but it really was our pleasure. The military gave more to us than we could ever have given in return. But you don't realize how much you miss being part of that team mission-oriented environment until you're away from it. And when I got back to FEMA, I guess in this case, I really started realizing that I was missing a little bit of that passion towards that kind of thing. And so it's just been a great, I've been with FEMA probably 2.5 years now. It's been a great ride so far.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because I've always felt like military and sports have so much in common. Now, one can be life and death. The other one sometimes is talked about in terms of life and death, and it's not. It's just the fandom in people. But there's so much involved in terms of teamwork, in terms of leadership, in terms of maybe some chain of command. That's obviously more so in the military. But there's a reason to me why so many people from both of those worlds are successful outside of those worlds, if they can make the transition, because of the foundation that they have. And what you just said about missing so many of those elements, that's what I hear so often from those athletes, because they've always been, put aside like the tennis player or the golf player, but they've always been involved in that team structure. So you now are back to that, have been back to that with FEMA. There's so much that you guys as an organization do around the country, certainly in this community, that most of us don't know about. You've heard this before. A lot of people think when they hear FEMA, the first thing they think of is New Orleans and Katrina. And because that's what they saw in the news, and let's be honest, maybe it's better this way, maybe not, I don't know. It's sometimes good not to be in the news. It's almost like, I'll use this, and we don't always need to do this, it's almost like a football reference. You don't hear about the offensive linemen when things go well, and that's the way they like it. Maybe it's that way for you guys too, but I know that you're involved in so much of what goes on in our communities, especially when things aren't going well. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the pandemic. What are the variety of roles that FEMA would have, let's just say here in this neck of the woods, in this region?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It's interesting. A lot of times when I'm around town going to and from work, I've got a shirt just like I have on here, and a lot of people say, "Oh, we didn't know FEMA was here in Kansas City." The country is divided up into 10 regions for FEMA, and each of the regions has a regional administrator and a staff that is really the operational end of what we do at FEMA. So we have a big headquarters in DC, obviously, like most federal agencies. And then we have smaller regional staffs that are really on the business end of what we do. And so we have about 300 employees here in Kansas City, Missouri. So we're all residents of Missouri or Kansas. We're from the local community. And we service a 4-state area: Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. So anything that is emergency management related from the federal perspective is our job in those 4 states. And our FEMA mission is pretty simple. We help people before, during, and after disasters. It's an absolute privilege. It's even in the military, sometimes the benefit of what you were doing was hard to see. I will tell you that it is not hard to see in FEMA. When we're out in the field doing our job, or even back in the office doing a function that benefits someone that's been affected by a disaster, or helping someone be better prepared, it's very easy to see the value of what we do, because it's all about helping people. Now, we do have some primary mission areas, right? And they follow sort of the phases of disaster disaster life cycle, excuse me. And so, we talk a lot about preparedness, right? So even outside of a disaster, how can we be better prepared as individuals, as families, as communities, as businesses, other community organizations, local and state governments? How can we be prepared for whatever is coming? And even in the midst of a disaster, we're always thinking, just like we talked earlier, even during a pandemic, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What would make it easier next time? How can we be better prepared for a similar event if it does come to us in the future? We also do a lot of work in the mitigation space, which I think is probably one of the lesser known and unappreciated mission areas. But it's really about how can we get our communities to be more resilient, right? So, think of mitigation as something like if there's a neighborhood that's in a flood-prone area and it gets repeatedly flooded over several times, repeatedly over year after year, FEMA has programs that can provide money to those local communities to be able to purchase those homes and move people out of the flood area. Because we know that at the end of the day, that's going to save people's lives. There's going to be less cost to the government at the end of the day. We're helping people by doing that and making those communities better able to withstand the effects of a future flood. But we also talk about building stronger roads, stronger bridges, electrical infrastructure, right? Helping people build back after a flood or any type of natural disaster, and doing it better, faster, stronger, so that they have less effect later on. And then probably the better known mission areas are our response mission areas. So as soon as a disaster happens in this region, we will immediately deploy people, staff from our office, to assist state and local governments as they respond to that disaster. Now, I would say that we're not first responders, right? The folks that, I always like to say at this point that, FEMA only gets involved after local and state governments are overwhelmed and need federal resources for a disaster. And there's a lot of work. In fact, the preponderance of work on disaster response and recovery is done at the local and state level. So all of our first responders, all of our local medical professionals, all of our local county emergency managers and our state emergency management teams, they are unbelievable And they are really on the front lines of all this. And it's really only when the disaster gets large enough to warrant federal assistance that FEMA will come in and help them. But we do. And we have specially trained teams here in the region that can deploy very quickly to disaster areas, whether it be a tornado or flooding or, God forbid, an earthquake. We do have an earthquake risk in Missouri and or any other type of disaster. And then the bulk of the work that we do is in our last mission area, which is in recovery. So after the immediate response of a disaster, we worry about the long-term effects and making sure that we allow families to recover and rebuild. We allow communities to rebuild. And so we're involved in a whole variety of functions. We provide a lot of reimbursement to communities for all the work that they did early in a disaster. We rebuild roads and buildings and schools and all the things that are going to allow a community to get back to normal following a disaster. And that obviously, most of our function there is providing money to communities via grant programs or reimbursement. But we do bring a lot of money to the fight, and we're really able to help a lot of people. So that's kind of our 4 mission areas. Where we're located, we have a wonderful staff of very dedicated public servants who, honestly, I've been doing this 2.5 years, but most of our employees have been doing this 10, 15, 20, 30 years. They're very good at their business. Their relationship networks are wide and deep, which obviously is the thing that best allows us to be able to do our job every day.
There's a lot going on, and I think what's interesting to me in terms of what you're talking about, and certainly, and I'll pop this up throughout the interview, that you can find out more information on what FEMA does, and so much of what Paul is talking about at ready.gov. So that's certainly an easy one to remember, and I'll keep popping that one up. There's sort of this balance between expecting I guess you have to expect the unexpected no matter what.
Right.
But the part of that unexpected is, okay, we don't know when the tornadoes are coming. We don't know where they're coming. But in this neck of the woods, they're probably coming at some point. We're getting to that point. And certainly, down, in Florida and Louisiana and places like that, they know when hurricane season is. So you know it's coming. I mean, you're not going to avoid it. But for something like a pandemic, and this for all of us has been a once in a lifetime experience, what was the readiness, or what was the mindset going into this? I think that a lot of people that studied this, I didn't, but just hearing things afterwards, this thing didn't just spring out of nowhere. I mean, it did. It starts when it started, and suddenly it begins to blow up. But I had certainly heard talk that, hey, some point in whenever, we're going to have to deal with a pandemic.
Right.
It might not be in 2020, but there will be one. So how much was there a discussion nationwide in terms of FEMA and saying, hey, whenever this happens, we have to do this?
Yeah, sure. So I would say certainly it's been challenging, right? I think that most folks would acknowledge that, we are prepared for a pandemic. We have a pandemic plan in the region. There's a national pandemic plan. States and localities have a plan in place. Primarily, it's our health and human services and public health officials that take the lead on that kind of event. As opposed to FEMA and our emergency management departments. But the scale of this pandemic, I think, is really what created the most challenges at every level, right? So FEMA has never had a major disaster declarations in every single state and tribe, a lot of Native American tribes and territories concurrently, right? So, most of our systems are, regardless of whether it's FEMA or some other federal agency, are designed to go to a part of the country or a state and respond to a disaster, right? And so we have the opportunity to move resources from everywhere else to that point: staff, equipment, supplies, But because this incident was affecting everyone across the country at the same time, it really was very challenging. And of course, not just the United States, right? The entire world was responding to this pandemic. And so when you talk about things like personal protective equipment, medical supplies, testing supplies, those became, it really was a severely constrained environment across the entire earth on trying to get the things that everybody needed to adequately respond. So we think we've been pretty successful. This is not a business where, you ever get to 100% of where you want to be, right? That's one of the interesting things, right? I tell people all the time, emergency management is not a business where you can do everything for everybody, unfortunately. But you try to do the most good for the most people, and we do our best every single day to, bring the types of support that our communities need. But it has been very challenging from that perspective, just because of the scope of the event. And I think the other thing is that, natural disasters haven't stopped, right? Mm-hmm. Now we're still experiencing that. We have a tropical storm that's building in the Gulf of Mexico right now, right at the very beginning of hurricane season. Luckily, in the Midwest, we normally are very worried about flooding and tornadoes during this time of year. And certainly, if you had told me before I took this job that I would have spent 2019 doing some of the worst flooding that the Midwest had seen in many, many years, and then in 2020 doing a COVID response, I would have looked at you like a deer in the headlights, right? But I think that the good thing for the Midwest, at least, is that the flood outlook is much better this year. But things are happening all the time. We had tornadoes in the Southeast several weeks ago, and so FEMA is on the ground doing those things now in a COVID environment, which presents another challenge, because FEMA's business is, as well as our state and local emergency management, is very hands-on, face-to-face, right? Knocking on doors, talking to disaster survivors, right? Bringing them to locations where we can do enrollment in programs and provide financial support, right? And provide housing and damage inventories. And so doing that in a COVID environment now with masks and gloves and maintaining physical distancing is challenging, but not something we can't work through. We'll be there to do our job, rest assured.
Yeah, and Paul, it's just Murphy's Law, or whatever you want to call it. When it rains, it pours, and that could be literal or figurative. And so you know that in the midst of dealing with this pandemic, there will be something else that comes. And I wonder how you handle that when it scales up.
Right.
Because you guys are equipped to handle anything, but some of it's easier, some of it's harder. And right now, like you and I have talked and discussed, this pandemic isn't going away. There's certainly the possibility that it gets worse again in the fall before hopefully we get all of this figured out. So what challenges does that present to FEMA, knowing that those hurricanes are coming? Knowing that, hopefully the floods aren't as bad here, but as well as I do that if it's not a flood up in Nebraska, it's a tornado barreling through Kansas or whatever it might be. So how do you juggle all of that?
Yeah, I would say two things. First of all, FEMA is very engaged right now in terms of preparing for future disasters. We just released our hurricane operational guidance for the hurricane season this year. But frankly, it's very good guidance for any type of disaster that we might go into. Mm-hmm. So our team at the national level has taken a hard look at all of the programs that FEMA delivers and figured out how to do them in a COVID degraded environment, right? So something as simple as we set up disaster assistance sites, right? Where we set them up in local communities and we bring people there. How can we do that virtually, right? So that people, we can avoid the congregation in one spot, right? How can we do inspections on the ground of homes and talk to families, but still maintain appropriate social distancing, physical distancing, right? As I like to say, I hate the word social distancing.
Yeah,
I
I agree.
I like being physically distant, but I think we ought to be doing more social interaction at this point in a pandemic. How do we get all the equipment that we're going to need, masks and personal protective equipment, not just for everyone out in the communities, but for our FEMA employees to make sure that they're safe when they have to do that. But I think we're ready. I think every day that goes on, we'll be even more ready to be able to do that. And I say that with confidence. We haven't done that yet, although we are doing disaster inventories right now for severe storms that happened in Missouri about 4 weeks ago. So we are on the ground. And frankly, we still have remote offices in Lincoln, Nebraska and Jefferson City, Missouri from the flooding from last year. So we're still doing that work because the recovery time frame is long on events like that. So we're out in the field doing it, and I see other FEMA regions responding to disasters right now. I think the other challenge that we have in this type of environment is just simply that, like I mentioned to you, I think earlier before the show started, that this is an odd event for FEMA because all of our employees and their families are just as affected as everyone else. I mean, we're used to getting in a car or getting on a plane and flying to a disaster site or driving there and working with disaster survivors, right? And all of our state and local emergency management personnel. But we're working with people in other communities, not our own. And now, we're personally affected by this disaster. Every one of my employees, I want to keep them safe, right? I want to make sure that, if they've been touched personally, either because they've contracted COVID, because we're not immune, or someone in their family, we take appropriate steps to make sure that the rest of our workforce is safe. Because listen, I mean, even myself personally, right? I work on COVID all day, every day, right? My wife works in an ICU in Olathe, right? So she's personally involved in this fight. My daughter, who's about to graduate or just graduated from high school, is a soon-to-be CNA going to nursing school next year. And so because of the COVID regulations, she's actually allowed to work. And so she's working now in a nursing home in Overland Park, right, where there are COVID patients. So it's not an abstraction to any of us. And we're not going out to help other people. We're going out to help ourselves, our families, our communities. It's very personal, I think, in terms of what we're doing in this fight.
How different, Paul, in terms of leadership, or maybe it's the same thing? I'm curious similarities and differences of being a colonel in the U.S. Army and having so many soldiers that are reporting to you and officers reporting to you compared to, say, this and your work with FEMA and the regional aspect, the local aspect, the national aspect. What are the similarities and differences in terms of leadership?
Sure. I think while there are a lot of things that are different about being in FEMA or any other government agency for that matter, listen, a lot of the longstanding principles of organizational leadership apply, right? Regardless of whether you're a CEO or a senior executive like myself in government service. And I think the two things that I was reminded of as I was thinking about your podcast are, one, we spent a lot of time focusing, as we did in the military, and I think as a lot of people do in the business community, on taking care of our people, and also making talent management is incredibly important, right? You can't, listen, almost everyone in our organization has been in FEMA longer than I have, right? So if they're depending on me to know about every single FEMA program, they're probably barking up the wrong tree, right? But what my goal is always to do is for our organization to hire great people, retain great people, and then let them do their business without interference, right? And I think certainly we've done that in Region 7. I think FEMA is very successful at that. But it's about getting the right person in the right job, doing a great job at hiring, and then taking care of them after, so that you retain that that skill set, right, and that passion and that experience, and that's something that hasn't changed, right, whether from the military or even from the private sector or now in government service. And I think that especially at my level in the organization, and certainly in the military at the senior levels, leadership is about relationships, right? I know that's where you live a lot of times, right? I mean, the relationships that you have in Kansas City, that you're able to foster through, the podcast and through the work that you do and the speaking engagements. Listen, that's the same in our business. I mean, we always say that you never want to exchange business cards during a disaster, right? After a disaster's happened. So we spent a lot of time in FEMA, putting up a big tent, right? Trying to get as many people from the whole community. And by whole community, I don't just mean local, state, and federal emergency management types. We spent a lot of time working with the private sector to make sure that we help them address their concerns with emergency management. Or in the private sector, we tend to call that continuity of operations, right? But it's a similar function. We work with houses of worship, nonprofit organizations, volunteer groups. We work with schools and academia and universities. We work with other federal agencies. And, a lot of what FEMA does, we can't do by ourselves. In fact, most of what we do, we can't do by ourselves. We are very dependent on putting that team together. COVID is a great example of that, right? We have about 150 people that are deployed to the COVID incident right now. But of those 150, all are not FEMA, right? We have probably at least 15 other federal agencies that are directly involved and more that are indirectly involved that are coordinating with us. The Small Business Administration, the Department of Treasury, the Health and Human Services plays a huge role. And in many ways, we're just supporting our public health officials here in Kansas City and across the country doing the kind of work that they need to be able to do. We bring FEMA, what FEMA brings to any fight, any disaster is organization, right? Going into a chaotic situation and bringing some order to it, setting up processes, deploying people that can start to think about not just what's happening now, but what's going to happen in a month, what's going to happen in 6 months. How do we assist people? How do we help people? And it's been a great partnership with all of the different federal agencies that we're working with. We work a lot with USDA as well, because the majority of our region is rural. So we're providing a lot of assistance to farmers, to ranchers, to the meat packing plants that are out there in our communities. So, like I said, it takes a team to do everything that we can do. And generally, when I give remarks, I get the privilege of going out and speaking to a lot of people, which is wonderful. And I typically say that, while FEMA's mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters, it's everyone's mission, right? It doesn't matter what level of government you're at or what group. If you're sitting here and listening to me talk about emergency management, we all have the same mission, right? Which is to be better prepared for disasters. And then when a disaster strikes, as efficiently and quickly as we can help disaster survivors recover.
So that leads me to my final question, and it'll be a way for us to tie all this together in terms of the pandemic and COVID-19, because, like I mentioned, we don't know when the next disasters are coming. They will, but we do know that this pandemic is still here. It's so interesting, and again, I see all the sides in terms of needing to get back to normalcy, needing to get this economy going, getting people out of unemployment. Oh, by the way, I'd like to get back to baseball as soon as possible, so I understand it.
Of course.
But then there's also the safety side of it. So, there are a lot of decisions being made here, certainly on a political level, also on a medical level. Sometimes those butt heads. I'm not sure they should. That's the reality of where we're at. But it's really interesting right now to watch because, as I mentioned at the start of the show, of the podcast, that I do sense a lot of people are letting their guard down, and at their own rate. I find myself doing a little bit that I wasn't doing before, not a lot. Then I look and I see what happened at the Lake of the Ozarks, and it kind of makes me cringe seeing that video, and it
Right.
certainly got a lot of national exposure. I wonder what'll come of that. Will there be a bigger outbreak of cases, not just from what we saw there, but if it's happening there, it's happening elsewhere? Do we see spikes? If we don't, do people say, hey, wait a minute, I went there and I was fine. I guess everything's okay. So there's a lot of unknown here. My final question to you would be where is your head at right now in terms of our community here in Kansas City? That's the bulk of this audience, or within this region, in terms of safety, in terms of what we're up against in the coming months.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And I get paid to advise all of those leaders, right? So mayors, county officials, governors in both Missouri and Kansas. And, I think that for the most part, our leaders have done a tremendous job under incredible circumstances, trying to understand the scope of the disease across a state, across a county, across a city. And, my hat's off to them because they've done a very good job understanding where we are and then making some very good decisions about community mitigation, right? Which is kind of the term we use for taking steps to, we used to say a lot, flatten the curve, right? But really reduce the disease spread. And I would just urge people to be incredibly cognizant of the guidance that's coming out from their local officials, right? My goal is not to put out additional guidance that may or may not conflict with what decisions your local officials are making. But we do advise them. And, the federal agencies that we're working with, FEMA, the CDC, Health and Human Services, are putting out a lot of guidance. So if you're a business owner, we have a lot of materials for you that can help get you back in business and help make recommendations. If you're a house of worship, we have the same. If you're a school, we have a lot of good materials. And all of those are found either through FEMA, through ready.gov, or through the CDC website. And I would just urge caution, right? No public official, including myself, can tell you, Joel, what's best for you, right? You understand what risk factors may be present in your family or in your community, right? You may understand that it may be best for you to hold back a little bit. I mean, we are certainly very concerned about the protests going on throughout the region and throughout the country. Not just because of the protests and sometimes violent nature of them, but also because it's a lot of people congregating in one spot, right? And I would just urge people to be, even if they're going to do that, going to participate in a peaceful protest, be cognizant of the risk that puts you at, and make sure that you are still trying to follow any appropriate local and state guidance, right? Physical distancing, wearing a mask, right? Some of the simple things that we really talked about earlier in this disaster, and unfortunately I'm hearing about less now, but we need to be talking about more, like good hygiene, washing your hands, right? Maybe you're cooking at home a few more nights a week instead of going out to a restaurant, right? I definitely don't want to advocate, going out to our restaurants and supporting local businesses, because I do that too, right? But maybe it's time to think about, maybe not, going down to the Lake of the Ozarks, right, for a little while more. You have to be able to make those decisions for you and your family. You have to weigh the risk. And I can't tell you how to do that. I can make recommendations, but I would urge everyone to be cautious. The last thing that we want is another spike in the disease, right? We're doing very well in the region. Our case counts are starting to go down for the first time in a long time. And we want that to continue. We don't want to get ambivalent to it as we start going back and businesses opening up and everyone is rushing to get back to normal. And we don't want to be fighting a second wave of the pandemic later in the summer or in the fall. And so I would urge everyone to be just cautious, weigh their own risk, exercise appropriate measures like wearing a mask if you feel uncomfortable or you can't stay 6 feet away. Making sure that good hygiene is paramount in everything that you do, and you and your family. And I think we'll be okay if we can do that.
Keep thinking about it. I would have felt so much better seeing all those people in the Ozarks in the pool wearing a mask. I know that's not as good of a look or whatever when you're in your swimsuit, but I would have felt at least a little better at it. It might be asking too much. I feel better. There's been some really inspirational moments in these protests with great dialogue coming oftentimes from the police and the protesters, ending in taking a knee or hugs, and it really warms your heart. And maybe this is where we're at nowadays, but I'm looking at it saying, oh my gosh, that feels so good. I wish you were wearing a mask at least, so maybe that's where I'm at, but I guess I'm more on the cautious side, and I guess that's a good thing. So regardless, I know we all want the same thing. We all want to be safe. We can and should come to agreement on that. Maybe how we get there is different. I know that you all at FEMA have a major part in that. And this, Paul's been really enlightening for me, and I hope for my viewers, whether they're watching it live right now or watching it later. The beauty of social media is they can find it later on Facebook and YouTube and all those spots that it'll be up there. But I really appreciate one, your perspective and helping educate me and everyone watching on what FEMA does. Also, your standing in this community. You're a community member just like the rest of us. And thanks to all the people that work for you in the region, and certainly all the rest around the country. This has been really good. It's been in the works, I think, for a long time, and that's the way that goes sometimes. But I'm glad that we finally had a chance to connect and do so on episode 50.
Yeah, no, it's a great privilege to talk with you and to have the reach that your podcast has. I would just highlight one other thing too. Our region is very active on social media. If you have an interest in FEMA or what's going on with certainly with what's going on with COVID or any other natural disaster, you can follow us on Twitter. We have a significant reach there. I'm pretty active on Twitter too. If you can find FEMA Region 7, you'll find me probably. I think if that's something that interests you, you can watch, you can see what's happening just by following us on that platform.
So I'm going to pop this up right now because I think I have it right. I believe, of course, that's without. It's
it should be easy. Yep, at FEMA Region 7. So if you
At
follow that, you'll be up on the latest and greatest, and we link all the time to CDC guidance, state, what all the different states in our regions are doing, and in what we're doing, and try to get the word out. So that'd be great.
Well, I just jumped on it, so you just added one more follower. I did that
Awesome.
as you were giving that. So FEMA Region 7, if you're looking for updates, you can pop that into Twitter. You can go to the website, ready.gov. Again, Paul, thanks for all that you and everyone at FEMA are doing to keep us safe. Thanks for your service.
Thank you, Joe.
I will pass on that message tomorrow about Beat Navy. I don't know how well it'll be received from the Rear Admiral. The Brigadier General will absolutely embrace what you have said, but
of course,
of course he will. That's part of the fun of it. We don't get to have Army Navy football games every single week. It's just one weekend of the year. So, sometimes we have to be able to have these discussions, and they're good ones to have too. So
that's right.
Paul, I appreciate it again. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, great to visit with Paul Taylor of FEMA. Really interesting to hear that perspective. Paul, hang tight, and I'll jump back on with you off air in just a moment. I want to wrap up this episode with a couple of thoughts. First and foremost, I can't do this without my sponsors. I could do it. It certainly helps to have their support. My newest sponsor is JJ's Wine and Spirits. If you're down in the Johnson County area near Overland Park, really simple to find. Antioch and College, southwest corner. Very helpful staff. Definitely has that local, mom and pop type of feel, I guess is the way that I would put it. They take care of their people in there, which is awesome, and the way that they help out their customers with suggestions. And tomorrow, 15% off of bottles of wine. It is Wine Wednesday. Casey Cattle Company, you can check out their social media or their website. Wagyu Beef, veteran owned and operated, led by former U.S. Army Ranger Patrick Montgomery. If you like beef, steak, all that type of things, trust me, it will change your life. We love it here in the Goldberg House. And a huge thanks to my friends at Enterprise Bank and Trust. Hashtag no stopping you. They have been phenomenal every step of the way. So I started this thing in March. The first episode was right as this pandemic and the quarantine was beginning. It was about the third week of March, and I just thought, here's something different to do, a chance to add to my weekly audio podcast, a chance to connect with audiences. I've had such a wide variety of guests talking about leadership and talking about really moments that can warm the heart here in our community. I would expect no less from the citizens in Kansas City, watching the pivots that have happened, the struggles, and overcoming that adversity, and there'll be so much more. So it's been my privilege to be able to host this podcast Monday through Friday. That will continue. Thanks to my guests from the first 50, and here's to another 50 and many more to come. I'm Joel Goldberg. Thanks for watching Rounding the Bases Live, presented by Enterprise Bank and Trust.